If you go chronologically, just about the first thing that Machine Head's newer, more contemplative BJ Blaskowicz says is to declare with total surety that America would never fall to the Reich. It's 1946, and he's in the passenger seat approaching Castle Wolfenstein at the opening of the Old Blood. His OSS partner knows better, though. Later, in The New Order's 1960, BJ is absolutely beside himself when Anya's grandparents tell him about how America surrendered when the Nazis nuked Manhattan. BJ Blaskowicz is a straightforward man with a straightforward job. America is the home of the free, freedom's worth defending. What more to it is there than that? Wolfenstein: The New Colossus offers a vision of a Nazi-occupied America that's alternately cutting and crass, grounded in human truths, but expressed in loud colors and cartoon twists. BJ Blaskowicz is the foundation that it all stands on. He not only believes in America's most aspirational vision of itself, he embodies it. I never liked superheroes much myself. I didn't like how their personalities became their shtick, their beliefs a kind of gimmick. So Captain America never did much for me on account of that. But Blaskowicz does seem to mean something to me, and he's ultimately the same character. The debut issue of Captain America had him decking Hitler right the fuck out. In 1941, before America had joined the war in earnest. The comic's publisher received hate mail from American isolationists and Nazi sympathizers for doing so, but it was the comic's immediate position, however, that if you did have one man who had to embody the American ideal, he wouldn't clown around for one goddamn minute about this Nazi situation. The United States has always lurched towards actually living up to the ideal of liberty and justice for all in fits and starts, but it is an ideal worth striving for. BJ Blaskowicz, rather than being hamstrung by his past as a cartoon hero of the more arcadey older Wolfensteins, carries over his simplicity of purpose to create a simplicity of conviction that feels genuine and meaningful. What does Blaskowicz do? He kills Nazis. Why? Because it is the right thing to do. The narrative trick of Machine Head's tonally audacious story is to use the bedrock of BJ's simplicity to hold up a much more morally complex world. America has disappointed Blaskowicz. They surrendered. Worse, they grew comfortable. The occupied Americans have excuses for why they went along with the Nazis. They have justifications and compromises. It's a little more complex than just killing every single Nazi, Blaskowicz, the world seems to chide. And to this, Blaskowicz might say, well, at least it's a good start. Even if he's half paralyzed in a wheelchair with piss running down his calves, BJ is going to squeak that wheelchair right up behind the nearest fascist and plant a hatchet right in that Nazi's tender Aryan flesh. This is not to say that Blaskowicz is one-dimensional. BJ only works as well as he does because he also has a rich inner life, because he does value compassion, because he does value life and liberty, and because what he dreams of in his quiet moments is a backyard and not a battlefield. Blaskowicz questions himself. He questions his strength and he questions his sanity, but there's work that needs doing. A bullet for every Nazi until the job is done. Well, a lot more bullets than that per Nazi is the way most people are going to play, however. Functionally, BJ as a player character absolutely is a superhero, able to execute feats of great athleticism with preposterously large guns in each hand and a laser cannon for backup. It's just not realistic in any way for BJ to be so talented at Nazi massacre. So, realism is completely thrown out in all of the mechanical elements and most of the thematic ones as well. The guns, the technology, the scale of the action, the gore, the violence. The New Colossus ratchets all of these things up to the point of absolute absurdism. It does this because absurdism feels great in a shooter. It's difficult not to compare Machine Head's Wolfenstein with the 2016 Doom reboot, because both take a classic 90s shooter and then draw out something that feels both novel and faithful. Doom is rhythmic. It's all about the flow of violence, empowering an aggressive player by refunding health through the glory kills. Wolfenstein 3D and Doom differed originally in how they treat the player, even in their 90s iterations. If you go back, Wolfenstein 3D is more immediately punishing. Blaskowicz is constantly outgunned and worryingly fragile. The environments might not have been sharply defined, but your attention sure had to be. The New Order and the New Blood carried on this tradition of player fragility and a more careful, hesitant approach to exploration than Doom. But this has nothing to do with realism. It's not like you're saying, man, I died after one shot from Mecha Hitler, just like in real life. It has to do with the game's mechanical self-identity, the voice of its violence. The New Colossus makes the somewhat bold move of rebalancing BJ to be even more fragile for the majority of the game, so as to more deliberately tie the mechanical feel of him to the narrative themes. Instead of 100 health and 100 armor, the player has 50 health and 200 armor. So if a player is careful, they can accumulate a major defensive pool that'll forgive the occasional mistake. But continually going head-to-head against the Nazis just isn't working the way it used to. Armor is farther in between than health, and if you lose that protection, all you've got is your broken body that maxes out at half its former strength. In the plot, direct confrontation with the Nazis is a poor tactic for the resistance as a whole. The new Colossus wants to make sure the player feels it in the moment-to-moment as well, in a tactile way. Only having 50 health means being exposed to gunfire for anything more than a second or two will just shred you to pieces, which, like I said, is actually pretty faithful to the Wolf 3D rhythm. The game is fully 2/3 done with its story before the players rebalance to 100 and 100 health armor again. But after spending so long managing your health, nursing yourself along in a flatly literal sort of way, returning to what's normal for the franchise feels like more than that. It's a recovery for both of you. When Blaskowicz is physically himself again, the player feels it in a much more tangible way than is simply expressed by the plot. You don't just sympathize with BJ now that he's better, you experience the recovery in tandem with him. What's the point of walking a mile in a man's shoes if you can't feel them against your feet? The new Colossus builds immediately off the previous game, in plot and tone, and sets itself up for a third game beyond the planned DLC. Many players complained about BJ's 50-200 rebalance, but if you put it in context with a game and a half before this one, and at least a game after this one, all likely using the 100-100 approach, it does function as a meaningful mechanical deviation, one that gives the new Colossus a unique rhythmic identity from its series siblings, and underlines the themes of its own particular story. The story suffers more from being a middle entry of a serial franchise than the mechanics do, actually. The new Colossus simply takes a long while to really get rolling because it has to reposition the plot and characters to do a brand new arc, taking them from strength back down to weakness and then shifting the focus onto new characters and new concerns. This transition isn't especially graceful, although once things get going and pick up momentum, the new directions bear some wonderful fruit. The new Colossus is very different in its first few hours than the New Order, in terms of tone, pacing, damn near everything except the Nazi killing, which is as gleeful and constant as ever. Let's go back a moment to talk about Blaskowicz's whole arc in the new games. The Old Blood, which picks up in 1946, also picks up exactly where the series left off in terms of theme and content. The presentation of the Old Blood, with its Tarantino-esque moments of dialogue-driven humanization used to intensify the brutality of the violence, was new. The castle, the super soldiers, the maze of corridors and bullets, the occult subplot with ancient artifacts disturbed by Nazi scientists, that's all completely old-school Wolfenstein. Blaskowicz is still his old self in the Old Blood, which was the major intent of the expansion, giving that greater continuity to the whole progression of Wolfenstein character and plot when the games before these were pulp schlock nonsense in a kind of classic 90s vein. The end of the Old Blood sets up for a climactic confrontation with the main villain from Return to Castle Wolfenstein, all the intel for the operation in a neat stack on a desk in Allied command. The New Order then opens with that mission already in progress. It's still 1946, and that continuity with older Wolfensteins is still there. It is not yet a fully different world. It's the castle, the mad scientist, the war. The New Order's opening hour is immediately enthralling because it begins at the end of so many other things for Blaskowicz, the climax of so many things. A new Wolfenstein beginning with wrapping up the older Wolfensteins, stylistically and thematically. And then the shrapnel, the coma, the passing of time. Now, the in-game Blaskowicz's position reflects his pop-cultural one, the same one Captain America reflected in his modern movie reboots. He's a man from a different era, a simpler time in terms of our national understanding of ourselves, and the moral dimensions of the conflicts that were taking place internationally. Blaskowicz and Captain America both represent the ideals of the Greatest Generation era, like humility of purpose, strength of conviction, and a kind of square-jawed honesty of action and speech. When we venerate the soldiers of World War II, these are the characteristics that tend to impress the most in the modern era. That sense that there was a job to do, a calling to do it, and that there just wasn't any good to come from shying away from it, physically, emotionally, or politically. The rise of fascism and its cancerous spread across Europe was a test for American cultural identity. Were we different or the same? The Nazis, famously, studied American segregationist policies when formulating their own systems of oppression. In the decades leading up to World War II, a comfortable and far-reaching KKK openly marched on the streets of the capital. Wolfenstein: The New Order tapped into Blaskowicz's old-fashioned straightforwardness in that Captain America way of reinvigorating a tired, cynical world with honest, optimistic action. And he won. At the end of the New Order, BJ Blaskowicz is broken and dying, but he is triumphant. His old nemesis is dead, his old world is gone, but the new one has hope. And that's a good enough place to leave things, don't you think? That's where the new Colossus finds itself, narratively. It would be fine enough to simply follow what went before tonally, having Blaskowicz and friends go on another Nazi hunt where that greatest generation spirit goes along, bringing light to the rest of the world, some kind of updated retelling of what World War II meant to us nationally the first time around. America had won. It had done good. It was on the cusp of an economic boom and a population boom and a cultural boom that would echo for the rest of the century. There's a particular pleasure in seeing an avatar of that innocent, optimistic, triumphant America brush the cobwebs from his hair and get back to work. But why did that feeling fade in the first place, nationally? Why didn't that simplicity of purpose and clarity of conviction last as long as the bunkers have? Well, flatly, because the world was always more complicated than that. After World War II, attitudes towards black Americans, towards women, towards the poor, towards anyone in an obvious outgroup in general, were not much better than they had been before the war. A dark side of the entrepreneurial spirit is a thuggish willingness to exploit anyone who's exploitable if it puts money in your pocket. By 1960, in the real world, things had grown a lot more cynical and more complicated in the national conversation because a certain amount of nuance was actually needed to address what was really going on. A change of perspective was needed, some sort of admission that America was not one perspective, but a huge plurality of them. In the New Order, Blaskowicz was a man from 1946 with a perspective from 1946, and that was a lot of the joy of the game. The new Colossus is the rare sequel that doesn't want to simply do the same thing twice. But to avoid that thematic repetition, a truth would have to be addressed. Blaskowicz isn't in 1946 anymore. He's in 1960, and he's changed the world enough that he is no longer a man out of time. It's now time for the world to change him. If Blaskowicz is a kind of avatar of greatest generation strength and compassion, then the same thing would have to happen to him that happened to America at large. He would have to be confronted with the fact that life goes on after our heroics are over, that his vision of what America is and what it means to be American is hardly the only one, and he's not the only one fighting for it. He'll have to confront that his ideal of American freedom wasn't always true, not even in his own home. In going through this process of questioning and fracturing, the tone necessarily shifts in major ways. Blaskowicz himself is dark and sour much of the game, broken in body and broken in spirit. But that's the thing that's most admirable about the new Colossus. They could have easily written their hero as a straight-up hero a second time around, but they didn't. They continued writing him as just a man instead. Fallible, foolish, frightened. And this makes his heroism all the more meaningful. It makes his Americanism more meaningful. And it ultimately makes the game more meaningful because it doesn't just uncritically accept that the greatest generation was the greatest because of some inherent and long-lost grit. It was because they were confronted over and over again with moments that would have allowed for cowardice, that would have tolerated apathy, where they could have gotten away with letting evil win out and done okay on a personal level in the end. That alternate America is the America of the new Colossus, an America under the heel of the Nazis that cannot stop admiring the craft of the boot. Meanwhile, the personal plot arc for Blaskowicz is the arc of our own real-world America that did not submit to the Nazis, but still had to contend with the fact that the freedoms that they were fighting for were not a universal experience for all Americans. To do all of this, within the context of a fast-paced, blood-soaked shootin' game, is a tall order, and the game struggles under the weight of its competing tonal objectives. But a complication that arises from a refusal to do the simple, safe thing I expected a game to do is a complication that I usually welcome. To transition from telling a story about a Blaskowicz from 1946 to a Blaskowicz from 1960, the game has to pull a couple brutal switcheroos. First, the villain. Death's Head was explicitly a mad scientist that BJ had been gunning for since 44 at least, back when he was still a voiceless protagonist. He was part of that world of comic book cheese. General Irene Engel is fully part of the new aesthetic and the world the MachineGames has created. She has a flying fortress called the Ausmerzer and an army of cyborg super soldiers and such, but that stuff isn't her main jam. Her villainy is the pure narcissistic love of power that fascism is, at its heart, really about. Frau Engel is cruel on the basis of ideology and whim, based on her feelings of superiority and her complete disregard for the humanity of others. When Totenkopf killed your friend and took his brain at the beginning of the last game, sadism was part of it, narcissism was part of it, but He wanted the brain mostly to do weird science stuff with it, and that was his main driver, psychopathic curiosity. He was an ambitious Nazi. He wanted to go to the moon, so he did. He wanted to subjugate the human will with machines, so he did. In many ways, he was a Nazi as they like to see themselves, modeled on folks like Werner von Braun. Von Braun was a colonel in the SS, and it's a matter of public record that he had prisoners executed just for looking at him in a way that displeased him. Von Braun's genius with rocketry, though, was hard to deny, and he was given a job at NASA after the war, and largely professionally forgiven, despite the fact that he was as much of a murderous Nazi fuck as the rest of them. The public sphere continued to remember the truth of him, like in Tom Lair's then popular song satirizing the man with lyrics like, "Don't say he's hypocritical, but rather apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Werner von Braun. But the U.S. government itself didn't think his war crimes amounted to much compared to the edge he gave them in the coming space race with the Russians. This was a historical moment where the real America behaved much differently than the Greatest Generation ideal. So in the game, in the fantasy, Blaskowicz forgives nothing. Even though it pretty much kills him, he takes that Nazi fuck down. Engel was a minor villain in the last game, but she was the more human of the two compared to Death's Head. She illustrated the true moral corruption of the Nazi perspective much more clearly. In a telling overheard conversation in that game, she talks of how she gave her daughters to the party, she gave her life to the Reich, and now she was as sure as shit gonna get hers. The only glory of power is the exercise of power. There is no high ideal, no actual depth. She is a small, intensely self-centered woman who wants nothing more than to do whatever she likes, however she likes, whenever she wants to. It's a freedom she's after just as surely as BJ is, but her freedom is the kind that comes when no one is real but you, no one is human but you, and so the whole world can burn so long as the marshmallow roasting is good. She is a more meaningful foil than Death's Head for BJ because, in a certain way, Engel does embody a kind of dark individualism. In Nazi-occupied America, this makes her a beloved television guest. There is a part of her cruelty, her narcissism, her desire to embody power and then use it on any who would oppose her, that resonates with some Americans. She's a charismatic bully, and in the doctrine of radical individualism that American culture is mostly built on, this kind of raw and vulgar display of power to crush those who even so much as irritate you can begin to look like real freedom to those who devalue the more casual, everyday freedoms they have, who see the world through a thick enough lens of resentful self-regard. Exploring the fascist mindset and how it interacts with American culture is a gigantic, tangled theme to explore in a game, but the new Colossus puts it at the forefront immediately and starts trying to untangle it. The first interactive segment of the game puts you in the shoes of Blaskowicz as a child. His mother is Jewish, and is showing him an heirloom ring passed down through her side of the family. Then BJ's father comes in, furious that the boy has been spending time playing with a black girl from a neighboring farm. His aim here is to hurt BJ, to beat into him some sense of what's expected of him. His mother throws herself in the middle of the fight, and your first act as player is to help BJ defend her. It's futile, though. The elder Blaskowicz is too big, too strong. He'll beat you both, and there's nothing to be done. The flashback moves forward, then, to the real punishment that BJ's dad has in mind. You're in the basement, still in these memories of childhood. Your hands are bound to a sawhorse, wrapped around a shotgun. BJ's father orders him to shoot his own dog. Kill what he loves. A real man can't go through life with attachment. A real man hurts others if it means saving himself. The player and BJ only have a tiny amount of wiggle room, but you can shoot slightly wide of the dog. If you do, BJ's father calls you a coward, and he does the job himself. But here's what matters about this, why we see these things before the Nazi massacre begins in earnest. It shows that optimistic rebellion has been the defining characteristic of BJ's whole life. And it shows that the America BJ believes in is one formed in opposition to the America he grew up seeing with his own two eyes. Later, BJ travels back to that old farm in Texas. The whole level is non-combat, just memories. Cutscenes play of BJ as a kid and the girl from down the road. There's a version of the world where two kids can just be two kids, and that's the version BJ ends up spilling so much blood to find his way towards. The America of ought-to-bes and should-have-beens. One memory in the farmhouse is actually positive, and it's this inclusion that really makes the rest of it hit home. BJ is having nightmares, monsters from the basement coming up to kill his mom. His dad says to him, the best way to solve a problem is just to face it head on. We'll go together into the basement, we'll flush the monsters out, and you can keep this gun for your own. It's not that this man is inhuman, unfeeling. It's that BJ's dad has a system of belief and values and way of looking at the world that devalues his own humanity. BJ's dad adopted such a defensive posture with the world, such a resentful posture, that everything there is comes down to what you've got and who can take it from you. He desperately wants BJ to see the world through what he thinks are a man's eyes: cruel, dispassionate, covetous. He sees his wife's intelligence and fierceness of personality, and in that he sees a rival, not a partner. He sees an enemy in her equality to him. Only as someone lesser would BJ's dad ever be comfortable with his mom's presence. When the Nazis take over, he sells her out. He lets her be taken to the camps. And he tells BJ this pridefully, spitefully. He finally won this battle that he invented between the two of them, and now she's dead, and he's the victor. He is the man. He has a big farm that they gave him for collaborating. A man can do well for himself under the Nazis, he says. Like Frau Engel, the elder Blaskowicz only ever cared about himself and what he could get, what he could take, what he could keep. BJ learned a lot of lessons down in that basement. Power, like the power of his father's shotgun, can be used to unite and protect. For one moment there, he and his dad saw each other as real people. For a moment, his father's mask of resentful hatred slipped. They were together, once, at one moment, against the monsters. And then he shoots BJ's dog to teach him a lesson, just to say that the very sentimentality that he briefly displayed in that moment will only hurt you, to say that you must hurt others before that happens. But BJ doesn't have to be that way. No one has to be anything. That's the root of fascism. Fear, pervasive, rootless fear, that everyone is after what you've got, and the only thing for it is to dominate them first. Strengthen others is a danger to the self from that perspective. If this was what BJ would eventually come to believe, the Nazis would feel like a comfortable fit for him, and there would be no game here. But instead, Blaskowicz went off and he joined the army. He spent his life fighting for the America of ought-to-bes and should-have-beens. America still fell to the Nazis. His dog was still shot by his dad. But the act of turning the gun away, the act of resistance, still meant something deep. To be true to your own humanity is to hold on to something that no one else can ever actually take away from you. About the longest sequence in the game is Engel's best effort to take that humanity away from BJ. After being sold out by his father, Blaskowicz is captured by the Nazis and left to the Frau's devices. One of the game's most shocking, brilliant moments happens here. BJ is told he's entitled to see a lawyer. This seems unusual, but okay. The lawyer is a friend that he made in New York, a wiry, short-nerved conspiracy theorist nicknamed Super Spesh. He has, of course, a plot to break you out of the prison. It's wild, it's desperate, it's exactly the kind of thing that would have worked in the New Order. All it'll take to start is distracting the guard, so he does, and the moment Spesh raises his hidden knife, he's gunned down by another guard who knew this moment was coming. The guards laugh at Spesh's inept cover and haphazard plan. Engel comes in herself to gloat, to let both the player and BJ know that she was always in control. She could never wound BJ as deeply with knives or hammers or blowtorches as she could with hope, so that's exactly what she did. What the player experiences is a shadowy fragment of what Blaskowicz must feel, but it's still the same flavor of bitter evil disappointment. To Frau Engel, people are nothing, playthings. When BJ first met her in the New Order, he was made to play a game with her on the night train to Berlin. There was no way to win besides to show deference and fear, no object besides an opportunity for the Frau to demonstrate that control. For one of the first times in the series, here at the midpoint, BJ is truly and completely without hope and without escape. And so the game does again for the player what it did for BJ just now with Super Spesh's impossible rescue idea. One of the hardest levels in the game is here at BJ's trial. At the moment of sentencing, Blaskowicz breaks his bonds, seizes a weapon, and proceeds to fight through a rapidly escalating series of reinforcement waves, eventually slowly unlocking more parts of the courthouse with larger weapons and more defensible positions. Initially, when it's just you on the stand and cowering behind the judge's bench with a single stolen rifle, it seems kind of hopeless. Then, slowly, surely, the corpses pile up high enough that you start feeling safe behind them. The new Colossus blends the arc they're putting BJ through with the player's mechanically driven, moment-to-moment wavelength of emotional engagement. Even if you're losing the player on the plot, if they don't care about Super Spesh and don't care about Blaskowicz, if they only care about the shooting, then here it is. The whole level is a joy. The courtroom itself is decadent and imposing, and every piece of furniture your shotgun splinters seems convincingly expensive. The way it escalates and opens up more and more is a kind of trick that you'd expect from the 2016 Doom reboot instead of here, blatantly mechanical and breathlessly fun. When it's finally over and you've won, that moment of taking a deep breath and being done with the killing, even for a moment, is so satisfying. The pressure of the reinforcements barely lets up at all until the very end, in contrast to the guerrilla warfare of the previous levels. It's like an old-school level of Wolf 3D, like the levels you could replay as dream sequences in the Old Blood and the New Order. So really, you should have known for some time that it was a dream sequence in this game as well. Behind the golden doors leading to your escape is BJ's mother. He knows she's dead, but if this is a dream, he'll do it as he likes. He admits to her that he's tired, scared, old, all the worn-out, beaten-down, spent-up things that he never thought he'd be, and a previous generation of action protagonists, himself included, would probably never admit to being. In the fantasy, the player is powerful. There is always escape. For BJ, that's just not true anymore. This is what makes Wolfenstein 2 work so well when it does work. Its deftness in weaving emotional depth in and out of pure blood-soaked absurdism. That battle in the courtroom felt good. It's what I wanted for BJ, a moment of transcendent, fully automatic defiance. And then the game gives that to you, and then takes it away immediately. To BJ, it then delicately says, but you know that's not how it is. You know it's harder than that. And then BJ just says, in his earnest way, I know. Tonally, it's pretty much having your cake and eating it too. They're trying to simultaneously hit the high notes of pulp sci-fi and the low notes of anguished desperation. And you know what? They get them both. It's a method of storytelling that's dependent on your openness to the idea that the two styles can even be held in proximity at all. A lot of the frustration directed at the new Colossus was the sense that it was waffling too frequently between the emotional wavelengths, that it should just go ahead and pick one. Instead, the game keeps them in tension at all times, two magnets of the same polarity held close through effort but never able to touch. The world and character building were a little more of a unified front in the New Order as well. It lent an impression that the pulp was more in service of the characters than an end in itself. Death's Head and all that, was legacy world building. What New Order was about was establishing a new platform to build out stories from, grounded in a community of new characters. The new Colossus overturns the hard-won equilibrium of that community within an hour of pressing new game. At the end of the New Order, BJ is pretty much dead, but in the words of Miracle Max, just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. BJ's missing most of his intestines and can no longer walk. He pees in a bag, which Engel thinks is truly, truly hilarious. In the previous game, Carolyn Becker, herself a character actually borrowed and refurbished from the 2008 Wolfenstein reboot, used a mechanical suit to perform acts of athleticism that she couldn't with her own body, having suffered similarly dire injuries at the end of that even older Wolfenstein title. But Engel kills Becker at the beginning of the second level, and you get her suit, effectuating the 5200 combat rebalance, and allowing you to continue to move around the environment as the player like you always have, while still leaving room to explore BJ's physical fragility and emotional fragility and weakness in the script. It's a swap that makes a lot of sense in terms of plotting, but Becker held the group together. Without her, the optimism is diminished, the outlook is muddier. Of course, that's all artistically deliberate, intended to create the low point from which the new arc of the story can bounce out from, but it runs counter to the expectation that a sequel will necessarily play to the strengths of the preceding work. Killing a character critical to the ensemble's cohesion in the introduction, that is an unusual dedication to wiping the slate clean for a new, more independent story. It's not just Blaskowicz and friends anymore. In that low moment after the introduction, though, the game makes its biggest mistake, throwing an unremarkable, thematically independent level right there at the moment where the tonal and thematic changes had ripped ragged holes in a player's expectations of how the new Colossus was going to go as a game. There are big questions of who are they now and how to carry on, but instead you answer the question of how did they find us by spending 25 minutes having a protracted gunfight in the ballast tank of a submarine. It's the most boring level in the game, by a big margin, the most unnecessary. And while I imagine it was put there to provide some emotional slack time after all the changes, it does not offer an imaginative alternative for the mind to focus on. Just, hey, here's some Nazis we forgot about, would you mind cleaning that up real quick? When the task is done, the game actually does begin to move, but the effect is like a car waiting too long in neutral while switching gears. You let the speed drop too low, and now the new gear doesn't have the power it needs to keep up momentum. Getting to New York and seeing what can be done about a Nazified America is the obvious first step, but it trips up a bit getting there. What's surprising about BJ's return to America in the ruins of Manhattan is that it doesn't feel very engaging at first. A lot of that isn't even really Wolfenstein 2's fault. The look of a mid-century atomic apocalypse is so closely tied to the Fallout franchise in the minds of most gamers that the connection is instant and unconscious if you've spent a lot of time with that other franchise. In an ideal circumstance, this gray waste of a city ought to be melancholy and grand, but it feels overfamiliar instead. Again, not really on account of anything that Wolfenstein 2 did personally, besides just flip the script on who nuked who in World War II. The gameplay, meanwhile, is kind of workmanlike as you fight gas-masked Nazi officers inside of rundown old apartments and offices. There's little about the new Colossus so far to creatively distinguish itself from other shooters, even something like Fallout 4, in the mechanical experience of these levels. Paired with the fact that this is a weary backdrop for a video game, and the submarine level before this was even more forgettable, and you get this kind of 3-hour no man's land in terms of player investment between where Carolyn Becker dies and when Blaskowicz meets Grace, Becker's chosen replacement. Grace Walker is a deliberately divisive character, but she's also the sharpest written in the whole franchise so far, and her purpose in the narrative structure is one of the game's boldest and most clever decisions. She's expertly voiced by Deborah Wilson, who puts a distinctively aggressive, high-energy performance into the character. She's able to do, in a 60-second monologue, what 2 hours of firefights among the crumbling skyscrapers couldn't in terms of establishing a thematic context. Her group of survivors live at the top of what's left of the Empire State Building, where the high winds wick away the worst of the radiation. She describes the day of the attacks to Blaskowicz, smoking a cigarette, nursing her child in the waning red light of the Manhattan evening. The things that she describes are identical to the kind of survivor stories that came out of Nagasaki and Hiroshima after the bombs were dropped there by America. Stories of people turned to ash, melted flesh, lingering and painful deaths that no one saw coming or had any real chance to prepare for. More than anything that Fallout is willing to do in its modern iterations, Wolfenstein 2 is willing to confront exactly how terrible a weapon a nuclear bomb really is. As a playground for shooting, bombed-out Manhattan is kind of thematically weightless. In the context of Grace's trembling voice and painful memory, it's every bit the awful thing it's meant to be portrayed as. This is, after all, what made Japan surrender in real life and America surrender in the game. Some things actually are worse than defeat, and atomic hellfire is categorically one of those things. This moment cements Grace as believable, emotionally credible, but it's the conversation she has with BJ on the ride back to the submarine where her role in the story becomes clear. BJ is lost, sad, so she pushes him, needling him about how his hopes and dreams are all probably kind of bullshit, right? In being pushed to defend his dreams and desires, Blaskowicz rediscovers some of the passion that got sucked out of him when Carolyn died. Carolyn led charismatically. She led as a friend. That's not Grace's style. She's a natural leader, but she keeps everyone at enough of a distance so that she can see them clearly. She's trying to get to know BJ. Suppose he is full of shit. If he's willing to roll over and give up, if a tired woman with her boyfriend and baby give him some mild shit, then he's all talk. He's going to be useless against the Nazis. Instead, Blaskowicz gets fired up. He's not all talk. He's a man of action, and he's now inclined to prove it to Grace. When BJ finally blows up at Grace a bit, she smiles. There's the man she was looking for, underneath all that grief and despair. And all it took to find him was to question if that man was there in the first place. A similar thing happens with Frau Engel's daughter, who ends up collaborating with the crew in an effort to find her own voice in person. She's played for laughs a lot of the time, and some of the jokes are a bit mean at the expense of her weight, but I was surprised by how real of a person they let Sigrun be by the end of the game. Even when everyone else begins to get used to her presence on the submarine and accept her intentions at face value, Grace gives Sigrun the cold shoulder. She calls Sigrun Nazi every chance she gets, and generally tries to constantly get under Sigrun's skin and provoke her. The thing is,
Sigrun never had it as hard as the others on the crew. She's never reached a real fracture point in her life. Suppose that she's only invested in the revolution up to the point where everyone's nice to her. Will she care enough to help then? Or will she run back to Mama? Eventually, Sigrun does reach her fracture point and starts choking Grace out, screaming about how she is not a Nazi. And again, Grace smiles. This is what she was looking for. Sigrun fucking hates Grace's guts. Understandably, reasonably. But when it comes down to it, Sigrun isn't going to run. She's not going to revert to who she was before. She's going to yell at the top of her lungs that that is not who she is anymore, and she's ready to fucking throw down about it. A huge amount of forum posts are dedicated to players talking about how much they hate Grace. But for her character, that's almost the intention. Is everyone here to make friends or fucking kill Nazis? Because if your dedication to your stated ideal stops the moment that someone is passingly rude to you, then your convictions were never on very stable ground to begin with, were they? The revolution they're trying to create here isn't about any one man or woman or perspective. It's about collaborative effort, hard effort, and dedication to staying the course even when things are at their bleakest. If Carolyn Becker had never died, BJ would never have been forced to pick himself back up, put himself back together, and focus on the broader goal. It would have been friends on a submarine. It would have been an adventure and not really a war. Here, the way they portrayed it, it is a war. And Grace is a leader much better equipped to fight it over the long haul than Becker was. Grace is a survivor. She lived in a city for 15 years after that city had been razed to the ground and poisoned forever. She kept going, kept fighting, because she felt she had to. She never needed someone else to tell her to do it. And that's what she expects from the people she fights alongside. If people were fighting for Grace, then the fight would stop when she did. That's nearly what happened to the crew when Becker died. By being so provocational, Grace filters her crew down to those willing to do the work because they believe it ought to be done. However they feel about Grace personally is kind of beside the point. It's a hugely, hugely different style of leadership than Becker. But by the end of the game, the crew is tighter than ever before and larger than ever before. Grace brings in her crew of technicians, she brings in strangers, and even more strangers pile on the submarine with every stop on the trip. It gets to the point where BJ doesn't even know everyone he's fighting with anymore. And this, too, is part of the extremely careful, considered escalation of conflict in the game. Blaskowicz is just one man, even if he's the most proficient ass-kicker out of all of them. A revolution necessarily has to be bigger than that. It has to encompass more. It accommodates people and perspectives that might not even like each other at first. One of the game's most delightfully ridiculous scenes takes place when BJ reaches New Orleans, where he tries to recruit a group of communist Southerners. While the Nazis attack, one woman snipes them from the windows, one man plays a jazz clarinet, and BJ and the leader of the group, Horton, drink shots of moonshine while calling each other politically misguided. Horton calls BJ an establishment lackey. BJ calls Horton a draft-dodging coward. Round and round. They hold diametrically opposed views of what America was and what America ought to be. Yet, they're in perfect agreement about the present. These Nazi assholes have got to go. With the jazz flowing up and down in tempo with the conversation, the scene is Wolfenstein 2 at its most artistically naked, a joyous argument over what America's could be that delays resolving itself by showing a dire vision of how it might turn out if no one felt so passionately about it. For Horton, BJ's jarhead idealism is irritating and caustic. For BJ, Horton is all academic and abstract where he could have been out actually making a difference. Well, they can both make a difference now. In this way, Wolfenstein 2's Second American Revolution continues to grow. These individual moments and set pieces are wonderful almost straight down the line, but the new Colossus is much less distinctive in its structure and environment. The shooting is rewarding and fun sometimes, but it rarely surprises the way that the script does. The way the New Order was arranged, with all its globe-trotting adventure, did well with a very episodic kind of structure. Each level was independent from the others, besides the linear progression of the plot. You were in Berlin, London, on the moon, on the Strait of Gibraltar, all over the damn place. Since the group was more of a small ensemble than a guerrilla army at that point, there was a consistency of characters that held all the otherwise loosely connected environments together. With the new Colossus, that episodic playfulness takes a little bit away from the overall sense of momentum and place. There's a sense that the game is preparing for the revolution like kind of a Wolfenstein American road trip for Blaskowicz, but the thing about American road trips is that they lean much more on the in-between spaces than they do on the destinations. If you bounce around from New York to New Mexico in 45 minutes' time, skipping over all of that land and people in the in-between, it's harder to get a sense of the scale or environmental depth of America that's satisfying. Again, this is mostly unchanged in structure from the New Order, but the new Colossus isn't exactly a global story the way the previous game was. I felt this most keenly when I was trying to use the Enigma machine, a later game feature that allows you to replay levels you've already been to for small bonuses. What's interesting is that the levels actually do change a little bit based on BJ having already been there before. You hear frightened conversations about the bodies he left behind, you find new parts of the environment opened up, you find a lot more collectible items. The most interesting update out of all of them is the Texas farmhouse BJ grew up on. It was destroyed entirely the first time around, so here they've changed it so that there's a giant steel privacy wall around the property, and inside, a Nazi filmmaker, some Leni Riefenstahl type, is doing a biopic about Blaskowicz, portraying him as a kind of deranged terrorist. But since she's into the opulent realism thing, she has meticulously reconstructed BJ's house based on the original floor plans. It's a great recontextualization of the early level, even better since you actually read for the part when you're on Venus. The more important thing about the Enigma machine levels, though, is that you get to experience each environment from a purely mechanical perspective the second time around, besides the updated way the space is framed for the player. As a pure shooting experience, Wolfenstein the New Colossus is just not as fun as some of its peers. The Enigma levels let you switch difficulty for an individual map, so you can experiment with a variety of game feels to see if maybe there's one that suits you better, but I found that the higher you crank the difficulty with this game, the more flatly unfair it felt. Although you're always balanced at 100 and 100 for the Enigma levels, the further the game pushes towards methodical cover shooting, the more lifeless it feels. The joy of Wolfenstein is in the sound design and the reactivity of the environment. Nazis absolutely gush blood and guts. Furniture and walls shatter, dust and the flashes of gunfire fill these often uninspired corridors with a carnival of activity. To dive deepest into those sensations of combat, you can't spend the whole firefight cowering behind a desk or a pillar, yet that's essentially what the difficulty curve demands you do. With the Doom reboot, the way it refunds your health means that higher difficulty levels simply require faster play. None of the player's capacity to be the aggressor in a given situation is much diminished. Wolfenstein, instead, errs on the side of defense over offense in most circumstances, which draws focus from action back to the environment. Those environments are either kind of straightforward Americana, or bland industrial areas, or colorful pulp sci-fi diversions. It's not that any of those are themselves bad, but as far as backgrounds and sets for video game action, they're all very familiar. It's the context and the characters that make the new Colossus truly worthwhile. When you try it without those things, the flavor is just pretty bland. And when you look at your choices laid out on the machine, they also feel a little incoherent. 4 options for New York, a few for New Orleans, 1 for Texas, a couple in New Mexico, another 4 on the planet Venus. What holds these things together? Well, Blaskowicz does. And without him, the game wouldn't stand as tall on its merits alone. There's 2 levels that to me demonstrate the ways the presentation and scripting is able to make up for some of the shortcomings in level design. The first is Roswell. Yeah, they do the secret military facility thing later on, but it's the town that's the most important part. It's the only chance in the game to put a finger on the pulse of the average American under Nazi rule, and man, is it unnerving. The Nazis have brought back slavery to the States, and you encounter an old busybody bragging about her stock to her niece. You encounter 2 hooded members of the KKK nervously trying to impress an SS officer who grills them on their German, since the day where English is no longer the official American language is just around the corner. Failure to have learned the conversational German by that time will be met with severe punishment. As the Nazi is pushing these good old boys around, and one of them nervously stutters, Vielen Danke, the Nazi just cracks up at this yokel's ineptitude of his command of either German or English. In this little scene, the game, though, is making one of its most important points. Namely, fascism is a snake that eats itself. These homebrewed American racists bought into the idea that they're white, the Nazis love that, right? So they'll be fine. As I've mentioned, though, there is no higher value in this kind of authoritarian power beyond the expression of that power for those at the top. The Americans might be white, they might hate the different with the ferocity the Nazis do, but they're also a conquered people. They are crazy if they think they'll ever be on equal footing again. So the newly reconfigured society becomes stratified around oppression. The Nazis at the top, the wealthy collaborators underneath, and then the great mass of anyone else not visibly part of the in-group far, far below. The trick to keeping people like that old woman at the Roswell Cafe or Blaskowicz's dad happy under totalitarian rule is to give those people someone else to oppress while they are oppressed in turn, like some nasty kid who kicks a dog after getting yelled at by his parents. Roswell is a tiny, tiny map with maybe only 24 notable conversations and events to listen in on, but the writing is so sharp and the points that it's trying to make are so concrete that it leaves an impression much larger than the 2 blocks that the area encompasses. The other level is Venus. As a sci-fi experience, it's actually not that exciting. Going to the moon in the New Order was ultimately a more memorable experience in terms of environment. Venus here is just dark rocks and yellow haze for the most part. But it also happens to be where Hitler, now utterly senile, has chosen to make his home. He's trying to busy himself by making executive decisions on the Terror Billy movie, and BJ sneaks his way onto Venus by impersonating an actor meant to portray, well, him. For a good long 10 minutes or so, this scene takes over the entire game experience. You're even asked to memorize your lines. BJ jots them down on his hand with a pen, but it smudges, so it's up to the player to remember or decipher what's left of BJ's iffy handwriting. This is probably the most wild, darkly comedic take on Hitler I've ever seen in a game or a movie. It reminded me quite a bit of the end of Inglourious Basterds, where Hitler is shown just cracking himself up in the theater, surrounded by his sycophants, before the movie breaks history to gun the bastard down and wipe the smile from his face. Like Engel, Hitler here is portrayed as utterly narcissistic. He's reached the apex of his existence, where he can puke and shoot people and hang around in his bathrobe, and no one will ever say one word to him about it. He's come all the way out here to fucking Venus on the back of cleverer Nazis like Totenkopf, and now that he's here, in his gothic palace on the fringes of human exploration, he can't think of much better to do than drink heavily and meddle in vanity projects. BJ is not supposed to kill him, not right now, because it would blow his cover. But not killing Hitler is quite out of character for BJ, so they let you do it anyway. They just throw in a fail-state if you do, to send you 60 seconds back to the autosave if the two of you just can't help yourselves. Hitler falls asleep on the floor at one point. You walk right by him, and you're given the choice to just stomp his head like a melon if you want to. It's crass, yes, it's over the top, yes, but the man never deserved more than the shit-stained idiot you see him here as. It's a matter of historical record that Hitler was tweaking out of his mind in the final year of the war. You think victory is going to make a guy like that better? Again, I look back at the New Order, and Death's Head comes across as a Nazi the way the Nazis, on some level, did want to be seen. Misunderstood geniuses whose inhumanity is supposedly some sort of strength, not a failing. This, while being on the face of it a lot ruder than anything in the New Order, hews closer to the ideological truth of the situation, that the fascist worldview is so narrow and so constrictive that they wouldn't know what to do with the world if they did rule it. There would be parades, there would be celebrations, then there would be boredom, then there would be pain, and then eventually there would be collapse. Neither the New Order or the New Colossus portray the full collapse, though. The New Order was a transitional title, establishing whole new parameters for the world-building of Wolfenstein. As a result, it zeroed in quite narrowly on the kinds of things that are important to Wolfenstein as a franchise. Its heroes, its villains, its history. That game was never going to bring down the Reich, but bringing down Death's Head wrapped up just about all the loose threads left over from weaving the newer Wolfensteins together with the older ones, especially with the old blood tacked on as a prequel experience. The New Colossus is about building a revolution, about widening the frame of the whole experience out, so that BJ is no longer the center of attention or even the most important member of the Resistance, even if he continues to anchor the player within the narrative. Where there was one resistance group, now there are many, under the same banner. As the New Colossus moves along, even into its climactic levels, it does so at a kind of leisurely pace. The first time I played through it, I was frustrated by the pacing because I didn't feel like they were going to be able to portray a long nationwide rebellion in any kind of length or depth with the time they had left. And I was right, but instead of taking us through the opening battlefield, the new Colossus only takes us up through what's essentially the TV trailer for Armed Revolution. Frau Engel is doing an interview in Los Angeles with her Ausmerzer air fortress parked above the Hollywood Hills. The mechanical climax focuses on that, a protracted firefight against essentially an entire air battleship full of Nazis and Nazi robots. The whole vibe of the place feels a little Strikers 1945, just over-the-top, wild and crazy video game environment. The new Dooms and the new Wolfensteins actually operate on similar levels of absurdity, but Wolfenstein plays it quiet and Doom plays it loud. Doom's plot refers back to the gameplay. Wolfenstein's gameplay refers back to the plot. Breaking the mechanical climax off from the narrative one in Wolfenstein 2 is a clever move and further cements the sense that the new Colossus's primary purpose as a game is to set up a third major Wolfenstein title a couple more years down the line. The last level is just the last level for now. The war hasn't even begun yet by the time the final wave-based boss fight is over. So BJ leaves the Ausmerzer, sneaks into the TV studio, slowly makes his way along the spotlight catwalks, and then descends an elevator to stage right. And the look on Engel's face is priceless. With death said, you fought him in his giant mech armor, the most dangerous of his creations. Engel, on the other hand, never much created anything for herself, did she? Her power is a matter of position and a matter of planning. Without her sycophants and her bodyguard robots, she is just a selfish woman in a comfortable chair, chatting and joking with a talk show host about the sorrow she's brought to the world. She is just a Nazi with a perm. And so Blaskowicz solves the Nazi problem here like he's solved them all game long, with a hatchet and a grin. The rest of the crew joins him on stage and calls on the audience to join them. My second time through the game, I liked it better and felt like it was a more definitive ending than I had initially understood it to be. This is properly the climax of the story the new Colossus wants to tell, which is, at its most basic, how Blaskowicz got his groove back. They deconstructed the New Order's ensemble dynamic and built something entirely new in its place, with BJ right at the tip of the spear in terms of a new attitude and a new body. Still, the effort to take all of these thematic, narrative, and character-driven elements and then orient them all in the new direction is a massive effort. It literally takes all game long to do it. And in the end, it results in a game that makes more sense episodically in context with the franchise than it does as a standalone title. None of the DLC continue any of the plot threads. In fact, they're all framed as comic books written by a minor character you meet on the submarine. There is a new Wolfenstein on the horizon for this year, but it's a co-op spin-off title that features BJ's daughters, not yet born here in the new Colossus. Machine Head has said that they still have the full third part of the story coming, but the wait is going to be long. It will be a much stronger game for all the groundwork laid here, but as for the new Colossus itself, it's mortgaged its own strengths for the sake of the games behind it and the games ahead of it, like in those cartoons where characters walk across another character's back to bridge a gap between cliffs. Still, there are moments in this game that are delicate, considered, and unforgettable. It's just seldom that those moments come up mechanically. The DLCs are a particularly useful lens to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the new Colossus through. As comics, each of the three stories are meant to be even more over-the-top and unbelievable than the events in the main plot, but with Wolfenstein's absurdity knob stuck at a permanent 11, this doesn't come across well. Instead, it just replaces naturalistic dialogue with more plodding, silly exchanges and motivations. This escalates as you move through the three DLCs. Each of the character of the DLCs is based around one of the optional body modifications that BJ could choose between when he got a new body in the main campaign. There's a strength module, a stealth module, and a much less useful and much less popular navigation module that gives you really tall stilts. The first character, an African-American football star named Gunslinger Joe, is based on the strength module. It's pulpy fun. You can use the melee bonuses to break down walls by running at them, you can tackle Nazis to death, you can throw tin cans at them hard enough to kill them. Meanwhile, Joe tells his own story of how the Nazis tried to make a mockery of his life, demanding that he let the Aryan team win in the Nazi-controlled Uba Bowl. It was that or death. But then an American collaborator, a dentist-turned-mass murderer, pulls Joe off the field to be experimented on. There's a lot to be said about how black bodies and talents are commodified in America, both in the past and in the present, and if the DLC had stuck to the naturalistic dialogue of the main campaign, it might have been a platform to meaningfully explore some of those ideas. Instead, it all kind of boils down to the broadest possible strokes of theme and narrative. Like this dream Joe has, where he's in a spotlit field.
Football was the only time he ever felt free, Joe said during a cutscene. Nazis pour in a big wave. If you defeat them, then the fog fades and burning crosses come into view. The announcer calls out, "Our home team, the KKK!" When you die, the announcer talks about how the crowd goes wild, and their excited screams fill Joe's ears as he goes down for what seems like the final count. It's a dream, a nightmare, but it's also Joe's life. He's an athlete and a winner in a world that has always set him up to fail from the beginning. When he wins only for himself. When he loses, the world grins from ear to ear. The DLC suffers in the environment from some asset recycling, but its most engaging areas are those where Joe fights through a small downtown area. The main campaign of the game took you to see some fascinating places, but this is what I mean about America coming across strongest in those in-between spaces. Joe spends as much time fighting the Klan as he does fighting Nazis here, and the unassuming Americana of the neighborhood does a lot to underline how, although things are certainly worse under the Nazis, these streets have always been kind of hostile to Joe. At the end of the DLC, he goes to Venus to kill his nemesis, the dentist Nazi, but going to Venus doesn't feel very personal to Joe. It's just where Dr. Mierza happens to be. This small-town firefight does feel personal. Like I said earlier, BJ Blaskowicz embodies the masculine ideal from both American and Aryan perspectives. The American dream was always going to be open to him, and his father was right on some level that a man like BJ could have done very well under the Nazis had he simply abandoned his humanity and collaborated. For Joe, he's had to fight for everything that he got, even before the Nazis. Football felt freeing to him because, in that game at least, the only thing he needs to do to win is play well. In American culture, those rules are much less clear. In a way, the Nazi occupation simplifies things. Those guys are a problem that Joe is quite equipped to tackle when you get right down to it. The next DLC is a stealth assassination adventure featuring a British femme fatale voiced by the always engaging Claudia Black. This trilogy of levels, called Diary of the Silent Death, is the most mechanically engaging by a good margin. It's a combination of two things, the first being that a lot of the environments here are completely novel to the DLC, at least as far as the new Colossus is concerned. As Agent Silent Death murders her way through the men who killed her husband, she moves from a gorgeous marble and darkwood Nazi mansion to a Hollywood movie studio making propagandistic schlock for the American Reich, and then finally to the moon, whose crisp colors make for a good artistic contrast to Joe's Venusian levels. These levels are all balanced around stealth-first play, and I felt more excited here by those stealth mechanics than almost anywhere in the main campaign. Silent Death hasn't got hardly any armor, and the levels are designed without a whole lot of cover. It's about picking your moments, aiming for the head, and feeling that mechanical resonance with the character's personality. Plus, Claudia Black is such a ubiquitous voice actress for a reason. Like Patrick Stewart, there is really no line of dialogue too ridiculous for her not to deliver convincingly. All of it gels together in a way that none of the other DLCs do, with a rhythm and aesthetic complementary to, but independent from, the aesthetic of the main campaign. Besides, it's also an opportunity to see slices of life under the occupation, brief moments of the lives and homes of some of the officers and collaborators who have prospered under the new system. Because the new Colossus has been so interactive with American iconography, that grandiose fascist aesthetic that the New Order had been so deft at portraying often got lost in the shuffle. We had Nazis getting milkshakes and complaining there's too much American food still on the diner menu, but it's still a decade or two away in the new Colossus's plot for the Roswell streets to have pop-up chains of Schadenschnitzel. Here, though, is the same kind of architecture you see in the Dream Sequence courtroom. Lushly expensive, massively open spaces that dwarf the individual and glorify the state. Part of the thrill of these quiet assassinations is knowing that the Nazis inside these spaces must feel so smug and so safe. Their space is meant to continually reinforce the idea that the Reich is everlasting and all-encompassing. So, slithering through them with a silenced pistol in one hand and a knife between your teeth, bringing belated justice for long-ago crimes, is much more satisfying than a guns-blazing approach. Joe had a deep, long-simmering anger. Guns blazing was his whole deal. It was really only the blandness of the first and third chapter that was the problem with Joe's story. Each of the Silent Death chapters is memorable, by contrast. Even the Moon mission, where the commander is inside a panic room, is great because the guy feels about as safe and as far away from the Silent Death as he can possibly get. But she comes for him anyway, and now he realizes that he's trapped on the goddamn moon with her. It's a fine flipping of the tables, one that keeps the mechanical rhythm of the predatory stealth in total harmony with the gleeful violence of the tone. The simplicity of the stories in these DLCs are a bit of a disappointment, but at their best, this simplicity provides a laser focus for the extremely short time that it takes to finish them.
The Deeds of Captain Wilkins, though, is just pretty bad from top to bottom. It's bad in a fascinating way, though. Wilkins is, in many ways, almost the same character as Blaskowicz. The Deeds of Captain Wilkins, despite its short length and cheaper production values, is like an alternative take on the whole arc of the MachineGames Wolfenstein updates. Wilkins, like BJ, is a man out of time. He wasn't in a coma for 15 years, but he was in exile. Thing is, Wilkins is a ham in a way I didn't think they'd dare put in a game trying to walk this fine of a tonal tightrope. Like, in the very first mission, he mutters to himself, "Back in the States for 15 minutes, and all I can think about is how much I want a goddamn cheeseburger." Like, if I was going to guess how a classic 90s FPS protagonist who never spoke before but was entirely defined by killing Nazis might get updated, this would be my first most obvious guess. The level design pivots back to anonymous industrial corridors. This time, there's not one level that's got a pop of imagination in its corridors. Honestly, the DLC feels like they're deliberately trying to be more interactive with the Wolf 3D rhythm and aesthetic, but it misses the mark widely. Wilkins feels the most like BJ does in his game feel out of the DLC protagonists, because the stilts don't add a whole lot of strategy, since "now I'm in the air, haha" is kind of a weak defense against enemies who can just, aim up. His daughter shows up after the first level, but even though it couldn't possibly be more obvious that that's who she is, he is just oblivious to it until the climax. In the last two DLCs, there were enough good ideas being batted around that the lack of depth in the dialogue and story setups was a manageable thing. Here, the whole feel of the DLC is bland, boring, and devoid of the kind of strong personality that makes the MachineGames Wolfensteins so thoroughly enjoyable. The protagonist is so thick-headed that he creates active dissonance in a plot that is only like 6 cutscenes long. And it's in this almost aggressive mediocrity that the miracle of the main game starts to become more impressive by contrast. Does the new Colossus have problems? Sure, but its essential structure, its most daring creative risks, are on a solid foundation. While the New Order was low-key enough to come across like magical realism, the new Colossus pushes things further towards a kind of punk pulp vibe, like the old Transmetropolitan graphic novels. As strange and unpredictable as that aesthetic can be, if you were trying to just one-for-one translate a 90s corridor shooter into a 2010s corridor shooter in the most literal way possible, it would be a much flatter and weaker thing than the new Colossus, even at its most self-indulgently obnoxious, was. This is much more obvious in the Deeds of Captain Wilkins, because it is that flat, weak, unthinking translation. On the merits, he's not much different from BJ, an old warrior who never outgrew the war, a late-bloomin' family man, a Nazi-killing expert. The difference is that I believe in Blaskowicz. I trust him to react to things in a way that's emotionally faithful to an actual lived human experience, even when the action and spectacle exceed anything remotely reasonable for a human to go through. Wilkins is a ridiculous character in a preposterous world. BJ is a man trying to make sense from nonsense. We may not live in a world of Nazi robots and permanent warfare, but the struggle for coherency in the world is one that everyone fights every day. The Deeds of Captain Wilkins is the worst of the DLC, but it's the most useful in putting the new Colossus in perspective with all the other ways it could have turned out, if not for the hyper-specific vision that MachineGames has for the Wolfenstein setting. The new Colossus is far from a perfect game. It's not even always a great shooter, but as a narrative experience, it's singular. There's just nothing that comes close to its delicate high-wire balancing act of cartoon violence and adult misery. Even if it were to stumble and fall into the safety net, still a hell of a show. Thanks for watching. I want to take a moment to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more on Patreon. People like Mace Valor, Comfy Hat, Leo Neal, Ethan Cossett, Christian Zacharianson, Soeb Sheik, Eddie Burton, Carol Henderson, Jack Dawson, Dennis Clark, Milky Way Resident, Dalton Seiler, Eli Bergmatz, Tyler Robinson, Corey Bofill, Jake Mays, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jake Brennan, Lars Braken, Kumaran Vijayan, Brian Hill, Aaron Darwin, Nobody, World War II Freak, Morgan Mall, Igor Babiak, Michael Benson, Alexander Leister, Tyler Rush, Dan Thompson, Thunder O'Brien, Tom, James, Ron Gervais, Jared Meyer, Sean Moss, Ludo Criticism, James Mosca, Boris Nielsen, Mark Phillips, Zachary Willay, Tom Painter, Lucas Kulagowski, Valerian, Dylan Ball, Free Morphine, Daniel Orrin Christensen, Simo Polakowski,
Daniel Floyd, Garrett Johnson, Jonathan Mitchell, Sean Weber, Samuel Procopio Xavier, Lawrence Hurley, Sam Addison, Colin Basnett, Ian Glascock, Sam Bellmeyer, Niels Bachfrummer, Roland Gray, Austin Matheson, Max Pantoja, William Tung, Stephen Garrett Day, Leo Peril, Fergus Foley, Cameron, Jacob Siegelman, The Soul James, Victor Felton, Mikhail Aristov, Verneral Herzog, Brandon Boat, William Holmes, Nathaniel Tenzar, Dana Stubker, Pipe Man, Hercules Johnson, Eric Amundsen, Tom Rowerdink, Jean-Philippe Malouin, Alex Zalato, Danny Kilpatrick, Tinfoil Pancakes, Mr. Pigeon, Joff Capo, Q-Ray X, Alexander Sundin, Pascal Moret, Medal of Connor, Nathan Jansen, Patrick McGanahan, Garrett Lathy, Dirk Warbrill, Eric Jepson, Alex Nikiforov, Clay Harrington, Jacob Munshi, Ivan Marinov, Colin, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Maxwell Reed, Byron Callan, Jacob McMillan, Daniel Rinfret, Anthony Bardill, The Noble Gamer, Noah, I know you're reading this out loud, Tizar Vicarian, N.K. Jemison, Hurd, Cy, Andreas Larson, Aaron Albach, Alexander Crons, Colin Schott, Matthew Sutton, Cale Perrion, David Betancourt, McKay Ash, Matthew Mason, Sergei Miloshishek, Kim Winson, Psycho Delicat, Kevin Schaub, S.E. Envold, Jared Olszewski, Cassie, Rich Stower, Height Envy, Skylar Vasallo, Jeffrey McIntyre, Jesse Wilkinson, I Cannot Fly, Low Beyonder, Andrew Bregager, Oleksky Shvetsov, Brian Pluckelman, Noah Kentrowitz, Zachary Berent, Austin Milner, Han Ziping, Toadhart, William Davis, Philip Coffey, Lasselis, Noah Duggins, Alexander Romanoff, Tayson Turner, Gold Team, Ashley Rain, Sean, Jan Hendrik Hansen, Manuel Wiedman, Jeremy Saunders, Colin Gouty, Andrew Boissino, Krimgi Schlapeps, Michael Coonan, Plebsy, Dominic Carlin, Derek Melicon, Max Cohen, Conceited Axis, Ivan Yanshev, Matthew Richard Tebner, Trivium Art History, Adrian Comole, Alex Alcald, Cyril Lane, Sebastian Pironi, Dakin Delamont, Rob Clark, JAC8A77AC8, Dewey, Tim Dodds, Dirk Warbrill, Joaquin Coleman, Oliver Ashton, Tim Marsh, Markalev, Gordon Graham, Josh, Connor McLeod, Will Dobbins, Will Wargrave, Vitor Titi Martins, Gilosin, Devin Fitzpatrick, Edward Clayton Andrews, Maurice Desro, SG Response, Tyler F., Nikolai, Daniel Wood, David Grabricki, Helen Ryan, Sharif Kazemi, Nemo Vandenbrick, Stephen Heim, Andrew Tapp, Calvin Reed, Wesley M., Peter Flink, Stephen Potyak, Cybot B., Tristan Madden, Jesse Denton, Kyle Zahner, Ryan Van Dyke, Ian Boudreau, Ralph Rainwalker, Jordan Klein, Argus Swift, Homo Vulgaris, Simon Anderson, Simon Nearfall, Andrew Opplinger, Tom Vickers, Luke Murphy, Oscar Stangenberg, Oscar Langstring, Josh Graytech, Sasha Aya, Alex B., Jeremy McQuaid, Greg Mirles, Vance Jordan Falls, John Siklowski, Izan Baguti, Tiernan Garcis, Michael Shalom Kesselman, me, Agardane, Zach B., Juju Bean, Galak, Elijah Nelson, Ryan Snyder, Stephen Wong, Martin Zerad, Jared A. Hicks, Edward Small, Eric Joyner, Matthew Cassidy, David Carlson, Robot Ghost, Michael Atwell, Daniel Mower Myrie, Piotr Kasperzik, Luke Mitchell, Carl Gleason, Amir Aguilar, Jody Warren, El Weasel, April, Abdul Rahman Alabsi, Jeanette N., C.E. Keene, David Harpstrite, Maxime Carignan Shagnon, Drew Castalia, Thomas Kistner, Aurelian, and many more who are donating less or anything else.